What if I told you that just days after the worst naval disaster in American history, a Navy officer murdered one of his own men to cover up a conspiracy? What if the victim was a young black sailor who had witnessed something that could destroy careers and expose the military's darkest secrets? Before diving into this shocking story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to stay updated with the latest true crime stories. July 17, 1944, started like any other sweltering summer day at the Port Chicago Naval Magazine in California. Located about 30 miles northeast of San Francisco, this remote facility served as one of America's most crucial ammunition depots during World War II. Ships arrived daily to load tons of explosives, artillery shells, and incendiary devices destined for the Pacific Theater, where American forces were slowly pushing Japanese forces back across the ocean. The work was dangerous, backbreaking, and performed almost exclusively by black sailors under the supervision of white officers. This wasn't coincidence. It was deliberate policy. The Navy had determined that ammunition handling was too hazardous for white personnel, so they assigned it to black enlisted men who had no choice but to follow orders or face court-martial. The irony was bitter. America was fighting a war against fascism overseas while maintaining its own system of racial oppression at home. At 10:18 p.m. on that July evening, the unthinkable happened. Two ships, the E.A. Bryan and the Quinault Victory, were loading ammunition when a massive explosion tore through the night. The blast was so powerful, it registered as a 3.4 magnitude earthquake on seismographs 240 miles away. Windows shattered in San Francisco. The flash was visible from 100 miles away. And in an instant, 320 men simply ceased to exist, their bodies vaporized by the most powerful non-nuclear explosion in human history up to that point. Among the dead were 202 black sailors who had been working the loading detail. Their white officers, who typically supervised from a safe distance, also perished. The explosion was so complete that identifying remains became impossible. Most families never received bodies to bury, only empty coffins and folded flags. But Marcus Williams wasn't supposed to be there that night. The 19-year-old seaman from Detroit had been assigned to a different detail, one that kept him away from the docks when the explosion occurred. As rescue teams sifted through the wreckage and the Navy began its investigation, Williams found himself in a unique and dangerous position. He was one of the few black sailors who had survived to tell what he had witnessed in the days and weeks leading up to the disaster. What Williams had seen would challenge everything the Navy wanted the public to believe about the explosion. Official reports would later claim it was an accident, the result of inexperienced handlers working with dangerous materials. But Williams knew better. He had observed patterns, conversations, and activities that painted a very different picture, one that implicated senior officers in gross negligence, deliberate endangerment of black sailors, and a cover-up that began before the smoke had even cleared. 3 days after the explosion, as the Navy struggled to contain the fallout and prepare its official narrative, Williams made a decision that would cost him his life. He approached Lieutenant Commander Harold Morrison, the base personnel officer, with what he had witnessed. Morrison was a career Navy man from Virginia, 34 years old, with 15 years of service and aspirations for higher command. He was also the officer responsible for work assignments, safety protocols, and personnel management, meaning he was directly implicated in the very negligence Williams was prepared to expose. Williams requested a private meeting with Morrison on July 20th, 3 days after the explosion. According to what investigators would piece together decades later, Williams told Morrison he had observed safety violations, inadequate training, and deliberate shortcuts that created the conditions for the disaster. He had seen officers betting on how fast loading crews could work, pushing exhausted men beyond safe limits. He had witnessed the systematic denial of safety equipment to black workers while white personnel received proper protection. Most damaging of all, he had overheard conversations between officers discussing how to blame any potential accident on the incompetence of black sailors. Morrison listened to Williams' account with growing alarm, not because of the safety violations, but because of the threat this young sailor posed to his career and freedom. If Williams' testimony became part of the official investigation, it could expose the systematic racism and negligence that had caused the explosion. Morrison and other officers could face court-martial, imprisonment, and the end of their military careers. In the racial climate of 1944, Morrison calculated that the word of one black sailor could indeed bring down multiple white officers if supported by evidence. Morrison told Williams he would look into the allegations and asked him to keep quiet until a proper investigation could be conducted. But Morrison had no intention of investigating anything. Instead, he began planning Williams' elimination. Over the next 24 hours, Morrison carefully studied Williams' routine, his friendships, and his habits. He discovered that Williams often walked alone to the base chapel in the early morning hours, a isolated building at the far end of the facility where he wouldn't be easily discovered. On the morning of July 21, 1944, Morrison intercepted Williams on his way to chapel. The exact details of what happened next would remain unknown for over 70 years, but the outcome was clear. Marcus Williams disappeared without a trace. Morrison reported him as absent without leave, suggesting he had deserted in the aftermath of the explosion trauma. Given the chaos following the disaster, Williams' disappearance barely registered with base authorities who were dealing with congressional investigations, media scrutiny, and hundreds of grieving families. Morrison's plan was nearly perfect. In the confusion following the explosion, one missing sailor among hundreds of traumatized survivors seemed unremarkable. The military was already implementing new policies to prevent further incidents, and Morrison positioned himself as a reform-minded officer concerned about safety and morale. He volunteered to lead the search for Williams, filing reports that portrayed the missing sailor as psychologically unstable and prone to desertion. But Morrison made one crucial mistake. He assumed that Williams had acted alone, that no one else knew about the evidence Williams had gathered. He was wrong. Williams had confided in his bunkmate, Seaman Robert Jackson, another black sailor who had survived the explosion. Jackson knew about Williams' plans to report the safety violations, and when Williams disappeared, Jackson immediately suspected foul play. Jackson faced an impossible dilemma. He was a black sailor in 1944, with no authority, no credibility, and no protection. Accusing a white officer of murder would likely result in his own court-martial, or worse. But Jackson also knew that Williams had been carrying a notebook documenting safety violations, shift schedules, and officer negligence. If that notebook still existed, it could prove Williams' allegations and potentially solve his disappearance. Over the next several weeks, Jackson carefully searched for evidence while avoiding Morrison's suspicion. He discovered that Williams had hidden copies of his documentation in multiple locations around the base, including the chapel where he was last seen. Jackson managed to retrieve some of these documents, but he lacked the authority or connections to act on them. Instead, he made a decision that would preserve the evidence for future generations. He smuggled the documents off base and mailed them to his family in Chicago with instructions to keep them safe. Meanwhile, Morrison continued his charade as the concerned officer searching for the missing sailor. He filed regular reports describing dead-end leads and false sightings. He interviewed Williams' friends and family, always portraying himself as dedicated to finding the truth. To outside observers, Morrison appeared to be doing everything possible to locate Williams while managing his other duties during a difficult period for the Navy. The official investigation into the Port Chicago explosion proceeded without Williams' testimony. The Navy concluded it was an accident caused by unsafe handling of ammunition, but they carefully avoided examining the systematic racism and negligence that had created the dangerous conditions. Instead, they focused on implementing new safety procedures and reassigning personnel. Morrison received a commendation for his handling of personnel issues during the crisis and was promoted to full commander within 6 months. The broader consequences of the Port Chicago explosion extended far beyond Williams' murder. When the Navy ordered surviving black sailors to return to the same dangerous work under identical conditions, 258 men refused, 50 of these sailors were court-martialed for mutiny in a case that would become a landmark in the civil rights movement. The Port Chicago 50 inches were defended by a young NAACP lawyer named Thurgood Marshall, who used their trial to expose the Navy's systematic racism and negligence. But Williams' story remained buried with his body, hidden somewhere on the vast Port Chicago facility. Jackson, the only person who knew the truth, completed his service and returned to Chicago, carrying the burden of knowledge he couldn't act upon. He kept Williams' documents safe, hoping that someday justice would be possible, but the years passed without opportunity. Morrison continued his Navy career. Eventually retiring as a captain in 1962, he settled in San Diego, collected his pension, and lived quietly with the knowledge that he had literally gotten away with murder. When asked about his service at Port Chicago, he always emphasized his role in the recovery effort and his dedication to finding missing personnel. He died in 1987, taking his secret to the grave. The Port Chicago facility was eventually decommissioned and converted to other uses, but Williams' body remained hidden somewhere on the property. For decades, his family received conflicting reports about his fate. Sometimes they were told he had died in the explosion. Other times, they were informed he had deserted and might still be alive somewhere. The uncertainty was torture for his mother, Sarah Williams, who died in 1978, still not knowing what had happened to her son. The first break in the case came in 1994, 50 years after Williams' disappearance. The Navy was conducting an environmental cleanup of the former Port Chicago facility when construction workers discovered human remains buried in a remote area near the old chapel. Initial examination suggested the remains were from the World War II period, but the location was far from where explosion victims had been found. The discovery triggered a new investigation, but forensic technology at the time was insufficient to identify the remains definitively. The remains were stored in a military facility while investigators tried to determine their origin. For years, they remained unidentified, just another mystery from America's wartime past. But in 2008, advances in DNA technology made new analysis possible. The Navy, under pressure from veterans groups and civil rights organizations, agreed to reopen several unsolved cases from the World War II period, including the Port Chicago incident. The breakthrough came when investigators located Robert Jackson, Williams' former bunkmate, who was living in a nursing home in Chicago. Jackson, now 84 years old, had kept Williams' documents for over 60 years, preserving them as his life's most important responsibility. When investigators approached him about the discovered remains, Jackson revealed the entire story for the first time, providing the documents Williams had hidden and explaining Morrison's role in the cover-up. The documents were explosive. Williams had meticulously recorded safety violations, documented conversations between officers, and tracked patterns of negligence that directly contributed to the explosion. He had evidence of officers betting on loading speeds, denying safety equipment to black sailors, and planning to blame any accidents on worker incompetence. Most importantly, he had recorded details of his final conversation with Morrison, including the officer's threats and promises to handle the situation. DNA analysis confirmed that the remains belonged to Marcus Williams. Forensic examination revealed that he had been shot once in the head with a .45 caliber pistol, standard issue for Navy officers, in 1944. The location of the body, the circumstances of his disappearance, and Jackson's testimony created an overwhelming case against Morrison, but he had been dead for over 20 years. The revelation sent shockwaves through the military community and civil rights organizations. Williams had been murdered for trying to expose the very negligence that had killed 320 of his fellow sailors. His death represented not just an individual tragedy, but a systematic failure of justice that had allowed a killer to escape punishment and continue his career. The case forced the Navy to confront uncomfortable truths about its wartime conduct and the extent to which racism had compromised its operations. In 2010, the Navy officially recognized Williams as a victim of homicide and acknowledged that his murder had been covered up by military personnel. Secretary of the Navy Ray Mabus issued a formal apology to Williams' family and posthumously awarded him the Purple Heart. The ceremony was attended by surviving members of the Port Chicago 50, civil rights leaders and military officials who acknowledged that Williams had died, trying to prevent future tragedies. The Williams case also prompted a broader review of unsolved military cases from the World War II period. Investigators discovered that several other black servicemen had disappeared under suspicious circumstances after reporting misconduct or safety violations. While few of these cases could be definitively solved, they painted a disturbing picture of systematic silencing of potential whistleblowers during wartime. Robert Jackson, who had preserved Williams' evidence for over 6 decades, became a symbol of courage and perseverance. Despite the risks he faced as a black sailor in 1944, he had protected the truth until justice became possible. Jackson died in 2012, 2 years after seeing his friend finally receive recognition and burial with full military honors. The case had broader implications for understanding civilian-military relations during World War II. It demonstrated how racial prejudice had compromised military effectiveness and safety, leading directly to preventable tragedies. The systematic exclusion of black personnel from decision-making roles, combined with the devaluation of their lives and safety, had created conditions that made disasters like Port Chicago inevitable. For families of the 320 men killed in the original explosion, Williams' story provided new context for their losses. Many had long suspected that racism and negligence had contributed to the disaster, but they lacked evidence to support their claims. Williams' documentation, preserved by Jackson's fidelity, finally provided the proof they needed to understand what had really happened to their loved ones. The Port Chicago Memorial, dedicated in 1994, was expanded to include recognition of Williams and other servicemen who had died trying to expose military misconduct. His name was added to the memorial wall alongside the 320 explosion victims, acknowledging that his death was directly connected to the same systemic failures that had caused the original disaster. The legal implications of the case extended beyond military justice to broader questions about statute of limitations and posthumous prosecutions. While Morrison could not be tried for Williams' murder, the Navy established new procedures for investigating historical crimes and ensuring that cover-ups could not prevent future justice. The case became a model for how institutions could acknowledge past failures while implementing reforms to prevent similar tragedies. Educational institutions began incorporating Williams' story into curricula about World War II, civil rights, and military history. His case illustrated the complex dynamics of race, authority, and justice during wartime, providing concrete examples of how discrimination undermined military effectiveness and moral authority. Students studying this period could see how individual courage, like Williams' decision to report misconduct and Jackson's determination to preserve evidence, could eventually triumph over institutional oppression. The environmental cleanup of the Port Chicago site, which had led to the discovery of Williams' remains, became a symbol of how the truth could emerge even after decades of concealment. The site was eventually converted to a national memorial and wildlife refuge, serving as a reminder of both the tragedy and the eventual triumph of justice. Visitors could learn about the explosion, the Port Chicago 50, and Williams' story as interconnected chapters in the struggle for equality and accountability. For the broader African American community, Williams' story resonated as an example of the double burden carried by black servicemen during World War II. They faced enemies abroad while confronting racism and violence from their own officers and fellow Americans. Williams' willingness to speak truth to power, despite the obvious risks, embodied the courage that would eventually fuel the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. The case also highlighted the importance of preserving evidence and testimony, even when immediate justice seems impossible. Jackson's decision to save Williams' documents for over 60 years demonstrated how truth could survive even when institutions failed. His example inspired other veterans to come forward with their own stories of misconduct and cover-ups, leading to additional investigations and acknowledgments of past injustices. Modern DNA technology and forensic techniques had made Williams' identification possible, but human courage and integrity had preserved the evidence necessary for justice. The combination of scientific advancement and moral persistence showed how progress in multiple areas could combine to solve even the oldest and most carefully concealed crimes. The Navy's handling of the Williams case became a model for how military institutions could confront their historical failures while maintaining institutional integrity. By acknowledging past wrongdoing and implementing reforms, the Navy demonstrated that institutional accountability was possible even for crimes committed decades earlier. This approach influenced how other branches of the military addressed their own historical controversies. Today, the Port Chicago Naval Magazine site serves as both a memorial to the 320 men killed in the explosion and a reminder of the individual courage displayed by Marcus Williams and Robert Jackson. Visitors can see displays about the explosion, the subsequent legal battles, and the long journey toward justice that finally concluded in 2010. The site represents both the tragedy of institutional racism and the eventual triumph of truth over cover-up. Marcus Williams was finally laid to rest in Arlington National Cemetery in 2011, 67 years after his murder. The ceremony was attended by military officials, civil rights leaders, and family members who had never given up hope for justice. His grave marker includes not only his service record, but also recognition of his role as a whistleblower who died defending the safety and dignity of his fellow servicemen. The story of Marcus Williams serves as a powerful reminder that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied, as long as there are individuals willing to preserve truth and fight for accountability. His case demonstrates how individual moral courage can ultimately triumph over institutional oppression, even when that triumph takes decades to achieve. In an era when questions about military accountability and racial justice remain relevant, Williams' story provides both inspiration and instruction about the long arc of justice and the price of speaking truth to power.